Hi, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and welcome to Gabe's Faves. In this series, I'm going to share some of my favorite non-mythic cards from the set. My selections are cards that I'm personally excited to play with, and I'm going to try and highlight cards that I feel aren't getting as much recognition as they might deserve, or at least point out aspects of the card that I feel are overlooked. Hopefully you'll find some new options to consider for your own decks, and I'll try and earn a like and subscribe from you by the end of the video. Without further ado, on to my chosen few. My first selection is Pit of Offerings. Pit of Offerings is a land with a cave subtype. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 3 target cards from graveyards. It can tap for 1 colorless mana, or it can add 1 mana of any of the exiled cards' colors. I only really play Commander anymore, and the decks I play are exclusively multicolored. So I'm always on the lookout for lands that can add 3 or more different colors. Additionally, in every single one of my decks, I make sure I have multiple ways to interact with my opponent's graveyards. And you should too. So imagine my delight when I saw Pit of Offerings. Well, you don't actually have to imagine because I'm going to tell you about it. Bojuka Bog is an incredibly popular card, and rightfully so. I won't argue that Pit of Offerings is better at managing graveyards than Bog is, but I think it should be included in the conversation. Pit doesn't hit the same volume of cards, but it should let you manage the most dangerous cards that your opponents will have access to. Another thing that sets it apart is that it has the flexibility to choose targets from among multiple graveyards, and that could be critical. Bojuka Bog does have the advantage of being a better land when you're short on mana sources, but let's be honest. How often do you cling to that bog in your hand, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it? There is a worst case scenario for Pit of Offerings where you can only play it as a colorless mana source, but I don't think that scenario is any more likely than the best case scenarios that Pit of Offerings has, and that's being a 5-color mana source. Unless your pods are consistently filled up with monocolor players, Pit should easily tap for 3 colors of mana. And while not being able to nuke an opponent's entire graveyard could be an issue, I think Pit should be viewed as a supplement to your graveyard hate package, and particularly as a way to smooth out the colored mana sources you have available. Overall, I think the combination of things that the Pit offers is fantastic. Incidental graveyard hate and mana color fixing. Pit of Offerings is a card that will do just enough to hinder your opponents while also helping you smooth out your plays. And in a game of Magic, those small incremental advantages will really add up over time. My next favorite is Kutzil's Flanker. For 1 white and 2 generic, you get a 3/1 Cat Warrior creature token with Flash. When Kutzil's Flanker enters the battlefield, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on Kutzil's Flanker for each creature that left the battlefield under your control this turn. You gain 2 life and scry 2, or exile target player's graveyard. So speaking about my love for hating on people's graveyards, my criteria for considerations in that category include being cheap, hitting as many cards as possible out of the graveyard, and being instant. Flanker does all those things and more. While being able to interact with graveyard shenanigans is important, it can be a real problem if you run into multiple copies of your hate cards, and you don't specifically need them. Flanker has a lot of utility that can provide a rather wide range of payoffs. Gaining 2 life isn't much, but I believe having multiple incidental sources of life gain really adds up. Next time you play, notice how much life you would need to gain in order to survive seeing another turn. You might be surprised to see what a difference just 5 more life could make. Scrying 2 isn't amazing on its own either, but when you need to find action or are desperate to find your next land drop, it can be invaluable. But the first modal ability of Kutzil's Flanker is really the most ridiculous part of this card. Imagine you're in just a normal, comfortable board position with maybe something like 3 creatures in play. There aren't any graveyard shenanigans happening, and you have enough action in hand that you don't feel the need to start digging for more off the top of your library. An opponent who's in a worse off board position decides now is the time to pull a trigger on a board wipe. Suddenly, you can be the first one back onto the board with a 6/4 creature that has haste, and only for just 3 mana. I think that's a very ordinary scenario, and I'm sure it isn't hard to imagine many other opportunities where Kutzil's Flanker could be much larger than that. So Flanker really is an amazing utility card. It's cheap, it's instant, and there's no telling how large it could wind up being. Play more graveyard interaction, people, and I'd love to hear your best Kutzil's Flanker story. To me, the least enjoyable games of Magic often occur when one of 2 things happens. You miss your land drops, or you can't cast spells. And usually they go hand in hand. Now, wouldn't it be great if there were cards that can help you manage both of those problems? Well, take a look at this. On first glance, they may not appear to be very exciting, but that might be because you don't recognize these as the potential ramp spells that they really are. Now, I admit we do really have to emphasize the potential part of that ramping, but look at what's being offered here. Twists and Turns is fantastic value. Granted, for the front side to actually do anything, you will need a creature in play first, but for 1 mana, you get to look potentially 2 cards deep to find an all-important land drop, or you can get a slight boost to one of your creatures while also setting up your next draw step. And it lets you kind of stock your graveyard at the same time. That's a lot of versatility for a 1-drop. And that's not even considering if your deck is using Explore as one of its focal points. If that's the case, I would say the value on this card is pretty much unbeatable. And once you have 7 lands in play, Twists and Turns becomes another land drop for free. And on top of that, it can be activated at instant speed to look 4 cards deep for a creature. Again, all of that stemming from a card that costs you just 1 mana. When you look at it like this, honestly it just sounds busted, doesn't it? And if we take a look at what Grasping Shadows has to offer, it gives the utility of making one of your creatures really undesirable to block. It makes it more effective at trading in combat or with multiple blockers, and it can really cause your opponents some nightmares if your attacking creature has trample. And as I said before, I think incidental life gain is a major component that should be included in all of your decks. And once you've enjoyed these benefits a few times, Grasping Shadows transforms to bump up your land count and nets you 3 cards at a very reasonable rate. In fact, I would say it's better than Castle Lock Thwain, at least for 3 turns. So both of these cards have effects that I believe are more useful than they seem, especially in the right context. They both offer ramp and some degree of card draw as well, albeit in the long run. I'm confident if you include cards like these in your decks, you'll have much smoother and more interactive games of Magic. My next pick is Dowsing Device. For 1 red and 1 generic, you get an artifact that says, whenever Dowsing Device or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, up to 1 target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Then transform Dowsing Device if you control 4 or more artifacts. Similar to my last 2 picks, this card turns into a land, and that is fantastic. But more than the other 2, I think this has a tremendous effect on top of that. Where Twists and Turns and Grasping Shadows provided long-term consistency, Dowsing Device adds game-ending power. Haste is a very valuable keyword, particularly with commanders that need to get into battle or start tapping right away to do their thing. There are plenty of options to accomplish this, but my favorite versions are those that can be used multiple times and can sit on the board providing value without needing more mana to be sunk into them. Dowsing Device doesn't exactly meet all of those criteria, but it easily can, with an abundance of abilities that generate artifacts just for playing the game. Even without the need to grant your creatures haste, once Dowsing Device is transformed into Geode Grotto, any one of your creatures can become massively powerful and pose a serious threat to your opponents. I think there are a ton of cool combinations that are possible with this card, and to illustrate my point, let me show you my next selection. Threefold Thunderhulk. For 7 generic mana, you get a 0/0 artifact creature gnome. Threefold Thunderhulk enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters. And whenever it attacks or enters the battlefield, you create a number of 1/1 gnome artifact creature tokens equal to Threefold Thunderhulk's power. Additionally, for 2 generic mana and sacrificing an artifact, you can put a +1/+1 counter on the Hulk. So granted, 7 mana is a lot to ask, and this card doesn't give you as much value as a lot of competitors at this price. But it is colorless, so it can slot into a wide variety of decks. And it lets your imagination run wild with ways to augment it. So if you cast your Threefold Thunderhulk with the aforementioned Dowsing Device already in play, here's what's going to happen. By stacking your triggers wisely, Hulk will enter the battlefield, and the Dowsing Device can give it +1/+0 and haste. Then you can let the Hulk's trigger resolve and generate 4 gnome creature tokens. That's 4 more Dowsing Device triggers, meaning your Hulk will now have 8 power. And since he has haste, you can smash into the red zone for 8 more damage and 8 more tokens. Of course, Hulk entering the battlefield will also trigger the transformation of your Dowsing Device into Geode Grotto. So, if you have enough mana to activate the Grotto before the Hulk attacks, it would have 5 additional power and be able to attack for 13, also generating 13 more gnome tokens. And that's just one interaction with an uncommon card. Imagine all the other opportunities with power boosting effects and anthems. Threefold Thunderhulk can generate an obnoxious number of tokens rather quickly, and those tokens can be put to use just by entering the battlefield or being sacrificed to any number of 100 other things. The scaling potential and bottomless depth of applications make this Hulk incredible. So I've already talked about some of the things I value very highly in deck construction: hating graveyards and having plenty of mana sources. But another crucial element is the ability to see more cards. Matzalantli, the Great Door, lets you see more cards. Granted, it doesn't provide you with a net positive on cards, and playing a Merfolk Looter for 3 mana isn't really that appealing, but having options is so important in a game of Magic, especially when you have multiple other players to contend with. I would argue it isn't really about having the most cards in your hand at a time, it's about finding the right cards at the right time. I also think it's easy for players to get hung up on seeing the front side of this card as not impactful enough. But I think being able to loot consistently, turn after turn, for no additional mana investment on a non-creature permanent provides a real benefit that's just a little bit harder to recognize. The fact is, it doesn't matter how many cards are in your hand when you get eliminated. If they aren't the right ones, or if you don't have the mana to cast them, what does it matter? And speaking of mana to cast things, you need to look at Matzalantli and its ability to loot things as an investment. Because when you transform it, you should be unlocking a land that can produce at least 4 mana. And the potential for more is simply staggering. Now, I recognize that there is a major difference in power level between this card and cards like Gaia's Cradle and Tolarian Academy. I know those cards are way better and totally busted, but surely you see some similarities to them, right? And I think any card that could be remotely considered in that conversation has something going for it. So in my view, the potential on this card is just tantalizing. It plays into 2 important pillars of any successful game of Magic, letting you see more cards and generating lots of mana. It'll let you see more cards to smooth out your land drops, as well as find the wheat among the chaff, and once you flip it over, it'll kick your deck into high gear, flooding you with mana to enact whatever your game plan might be. I think this card should definitely be considered in any deck that focuses on permanence, and if you're looking to stock your graveyard for any reason, I think the value of this card shoots up even further. I'm really excited to get a chance to try this card out for myself, and I hope now you are too. And by far, my absolute favorite card from the set, Brass's Tunnel Grinder. If I got you excited for Matzalantli, then hold on to your seat, because the Tunnel Grinder is the Great Door on steroids. Whereas Matzalantli filtered cards for you slowly over time, the aptly named Grinder churns through them immediately. As a baseline, you cast the Tunnel Grinder for 3 and draw a card. Not great. Discarding a card lets you draw 2 cards. Also not great, considering you can get this effect at instant speed and for just 2 mana. The real power that the Grinder provides is enabling you to trade as many cards as you want. In fact, you can even load up with an entirely new hand. That's a tremendous amount of cards to see for only 3 mana. And if you can benefit from filling your graveyard in any way, this card is incredibly cheap and efficient. Now, once you've taken advantage of the card filtering that the Grinder provides, simply just play your game of Magic as normal until you accrue 3 board counters and unlock Tekuktlan, the Searing Rift. At this point, you should now have a sculpted hand of cards, you've ramped yourself by 1 extra mana, and anytime you cast a permanent spell with Tekuktlan, you generate a free spell on top of it. And isn't Commander a lovely format? You have a permanent spell tucked away in the command zone, ready to cast at all times. That's a ridiculous amount of mana and value you're generating off of this one card. And if you happen to have an effect that can untap Tekuktlan, or cause it to generate additional mana, then you can now enjoy multiple triggers a turn. You're excited about this card too, Ted? Brass's Tunnel Grinder is simply bonkers. A whole new hand for just 3 mana, and a whole lot of mana generation just for playing the game. To me, this is a new format staple. I've already seen this card in action, and I'm addicted. I'm a true believer in this card, and I guarantee if you cast it, you will be too. And that will do it for my personal favorite cards from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Let me know if any of them were among your pet cards too, or if I've inspired you to add them to your decks to try out for yourself. I hope I earned a like and subscribe from you. And you can follow me on X at unsolicitedmtg for channel updates and other nonsense. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and who asked me anyways? Bojuka Bob is... Bojuka Bob. Threefold Thunderhulk. Threefold Thunderhulk. Bojuka Bob. I did it again.